Hi everybody, it's Ajanette and I'm back for part 2 of your developmental chapters lecture. And so I'm here to talk to you a little bit about prenatal development. We'll just go into just kind of the bare basics. Your book will fill in some details, but obviously it starts with menstruation where we release an ovum and we have about 24 hours to fertilize that ovum after ovulation. And then once it's fertilized, it emits, once it's released, it emits chemical signals to the sperm to kind of tell it where it's at so the sperm can easily locate it. And then we have intercourse or coitus, and what happens is the sperm live for about a week in the cervix. So if you already have sperm hiding up there and you've released an egg, it can be fertilized that way. Or if you release an egg and then you have sperm ejaculated or into the vaginal area, then of course it can be fertilized that way. Typically your female sperm live longer than your male sperm, and that's really the case throughout the lifespan. So if you're already going to have sperm living up inside of you and then you release the egg, you might be more likely to have a female. Whereas if you release the egg and then fertilize it, then most likely the fastest and strongest sperms to get to the egg first are quite often the male sperm. It takes a few hours for them to actually find the ovum. Usually fertilization occurs in the fallopian tubes. About a couple 100 million sperm are actually released, but only 200 to 300 make it to the ovum. And so we see that they have high fatality rates, even in the context of sperm. And then fertilization, you only can have one sperm fertilize one egg. As soon as that fertilization occurs, then the wall shuts down and it creates a very strong barrier that doesn't allow any other sperm to protrude. And then the two cells kind of meld into each other to create what we call a zygote. And they begin mitosis. And so, again, fertilization usually takes place in the fallopian tube. The sperm has 23 chromosomes. The egg has 23 chromosomes. Once they meld together, then they form a 46 chromosome zygote, which is a fertilized egg in the very beginning stage of a human being. So, our prenatal development occurs in 3 stages. These are not trimesters. These actually are 3 separate stages, all of which occur in the first trimester, and then the fetal stage continues on throughout the rest of the other 2 trimesters. When you talk about fetal development, I'm focused on what's happening to the baby, and often when we talk about trimesters, we're really talking about the pregnancy from the mother's perspective. The germinal stage is just the first 2 weeks after fertilization. Most of what's happening during this time is the zygote is moving from the fallopian tubes into the uterus, and it's preparing itself for implantation into the uterus so it can sustain life and continue to develop moving forward. And so at this time, a lot of cell division is happening, and it now converts from a zygote to what we call a blastocyst, which is a hollow ball, and it consists of hundreds of different cells now that are going to differentiate into different layers and begin that implantation process. And once implantation occurs inside the uterus, then we're now going to enter into the embryonic stage, which is the next 6 weeks. This is where the most fundamental changes occur, and all major organ systems are in fact developed during the embryonic stage. And so it also is the most fast-paced period of development. And so you have the circulatory system, the heart starts beating, the pulmonary system, the digestive system, the neural tube and the brain start to develop in the spinal cord. It has legs, fingerprints, arms, The only thing that's not fully developed yet at the end of this stage is you still do not have sexual development. So we do not know the sex of the child. That can continue to grow into either a boy or a girl. Has tremendous amount of pulmonary maturing to do, and then it has a tremendous amount of brain development still ahead. And then in the fetal period, this is the last stage of development. This is when the fine-tuning starts to take place, and a lot of the little fine exterior details are happening. And they're also putting on a lot of weight during this time, which is critical for brain development. The baby does, in fact, need fat. And actually about the 4th month, sexual differentiation occurs, and we know whether it's a boy or a girl. And then additionally, you start to have the baby showing patterns of consciousness where it has a kind of normalized sleep and wake cycle. It may not coincide with yours. And then additionally, at about 5 to 6 months, the ossicles harden in the middle ear, and it starts to have senses. It's breathing on its own. The age of viability takes place at about 22 weeks, which is the earliest age at which a baby can survive outside of the mother's womb. High % of death rates, though, at 22 weeks. Obviously, in developed countries where we have really great NICUs and hospital systems, the babies are going to be able to survive at younger ages. And then some principles that you should know is just development occurs proximal distally. In other words, it's starting from the inside out. Middle structures and inner portions are going to develop before those outer structures develop. Development occurs from head to toe or head to tail, where the head is the primary focus. And you'll see these patterns continue as development of motor coordination occurs as well. And then mass to specific, with first the gross like the arm, and then the fine details like the fingerprints and things, or the hand develops before the hands and the fingertips develop. Prenatal development, infants are extremely vulnerable to what we call teratogens. If you break down the word, this actually means monster, and genesis means creation. So substances that cross the placenta and can harm the baby and create birth defects are teratogens. They can affect the developing brain throughout the pregnancy. So if we go back a little bit to the stages of prenatal development, if they're exposed to teratogens during this stage where all the structural development's happening, they could very well have some structural challenges. If it's during this stage, they might have developmental challenges like ADHD, autism, things of that nature, where it's just affecting the brain, but their body is intact. Sadly, with teratogens, it's very unpredictable in that every fetus and every mom is very different. We each have our own unique vulnerability, and we all metabolize substances differently. So what might be safe for one woman may be terribly unsafe for another. Additionally, babies have their own individual variability, and they might be more genetically vulnerable than other babies. So if mom drinks with one baby and not the other, maybe that baby's affected but not the other. So because we don't know what's an appropriate threshold and what isn't, it's really best to avoid all teratogens, and don't drink while you're pregnant, and also don't get pregnant while you're drinking. Consider birth control if you're living that kind of lifestyle that could put a baby at risk. Otherwise, as long as we're ovulating, we continue to be at risk of getting pregnant. And there are sensitive periods. Clearly, that embryonic stage of development, the baby is very vulnerable to teratogens, and there could be some structural damage. And then, as I mentioned, developmental disorders have an increased risk if exposure is later on in fetal development. So this is just a great chart that talks about the age of fetal development and where the most vulnerable areas are if they're exposed to teratogens. So if they're exposed in these latter months, then it's quite likely to affect their nervous system, and then so on and so forth. So just a wonderful chart to use as a reference. The most common teratogens in the United States are smoking and alcohol. Smoking, sadly, 1 out of 9 women actually smoke when they're pregnant. And even if you smoke as little as 6 cigarettes a day, it can be detrimental to the health and well-being of the baby. The most common consequence is underweight babies and premature babies, which both factors put them at risk of early death and a higher infant mortality rate. So smaller and underweight babies and premature babies are much more likely to die than older, fully developed babies. They also have increased risk of cognitive and behavioral challenges, including ADHD, learning disabilities. So you might not think that you're causing the baby problems, but smoking constricts blood vessels, which deprives the child of oxygen. So there is really no good excuse to be smoking and pregnant. Alcohol is another, that is the second most common, sadly, teratogen in the developed countries. So the wealthiest nations are exposing their babies to two fully preventable things, and that's smoking and alcohol. Alcohol is largely associated with fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome also puts the baby at risk of a low birth weight. They have smaller heads, some facial abnormalities. You can look at them and see all of these different facial features, and they're at greater risk of developmental disorders, including ADHD and autism. They're also at a higher risk of having mental retardation with an IQ of below 70. They can have increased risk of seizures, including epilepsy, and having hyperactivity. You are at a greater risk if you're engaged in binge drinking, where you're drinking more than 4 drinks a day. But again, sadly, even a little bit of alcohol exposure can in fact put the child on the spectrum. Alcohol can also contribute to challenges in our stress response system, and so it can be detrimental to the baby in that way, as well as to the mom. If you have more than 5 drinks a day, you're actually at an increased risk of a stillbirth, which means that the baby has passed away inside of you in your uterus, and you have to birth a dead baby. And I've actually had a patient where they had to birth a stillborn child, and it was one of the most heart-wrenching experiences I've ever been through, and I wasn't even the mother. And it was a very, very tragic thing. I was a medical assistant at Loma Linda, and about 1% of babies are exposed to alcohol and have fetal alcohol syndrome, and it's just such a tragic thing. In this case, the mother, to the best of our knowledge, had a healthy baby, and we just weren't able to induce birth before the baby died. So obviously at some point the baby gets too big to live in our uterus, and we do need to birth the baby. So here's just some images of early childhood as far as how they grow and change over time. Again, you're going to see that cephalocotyle, where you see their head is kind of disproportionately large for the rest of their body, and then how they continue to grow over time, and it becomes much more proportionate. Motor control develops proximally, distally. We first learn how to hold our head in our trunk before we learn how to smoothly control our outer limbs and so forth. Brain development is another fascinating area that we study in human development or developmental psychology. We talk about how the brain changes and grows over time. And the brain development is very rapid in the first 2 years of life. In that first 2 years, by the time you reach the age of 2, you have about 75% of an adult-sized brain, which is fascinating. Neurons is what you see here. It's the basic cellular structure of the nervous system, and we have different components. So here's the cell body, or what we call soma, and then inside is the nucleus. So dendrites pick up information from other neighboring neurons and take the information to the cell body. And then this long singular strand here, extension, is what we call an axon. Axons take information away from the cell body. Around each axon is what we call a myelin sheath. And that is a fatty substance that allows the electrical impulse that travels along the axon to travel much more